Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks to those in the room who've joined us this evening, and thanks to those online as well. I know that there are a number of people online. My name is Bradley Williams. I'm Pro Vice Chancellor for University Impact at the University of Wollongong. And it is really a great privilege to welcome you here this evening, joining us on what we call our Meet the Researchers forum, where you'll hear from a couple of our researchers. And this evening also, we're joined by Belinda Barter, former Matildas player, and we're really grateful to you as well for joining us this evening. At the outset, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of knowledge and of cultural heritage on the lands on which we meet this evening, including those who are joining us online, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Right, so this Meet the Researchers forum of ours is a way for the institution to demonstrate its commitment to deeper conversations with our communities and the precincts in which we are located. And there are 9 such campuses in New South Wales, in Australia, and we have another 4 campuses internationally. So this is just, as I said, part of our commitment, showing that and bringing our research actually to the public sphere in a way that actually makes sense, and demonstrating that the research that we are doing is also focused on bringing benefit to society and the world around us. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Samara Walpole. She's an Associate Research Fellow in the School of Medical, Indigenous and Health Sciences at the University of Wollongong. Her research interest is in the investigation of molecular changes in the brain across a range of psychiatric disorders, particularly focusing on sex differences. Samara's research uses brain tissue to investigate psychiatric disorders with a specific focus on sex and subgroup differences. Her goal is to understand what drives these disorders in the brain and ultimately develop more personalized treatment options to improve health outcomes. I look forward to Samara's discussion on the future of mental health, personalized approaches from brain research. Samara.
Perfect. Thanks, Bradley. Hi everyone. My name is Samara. My research is more in the mental health side of things, where I'm focusing a lot on women's mental health. So before I get started, I do want to acknowledge that my talk will discuss themes of depression, and if you or anyone you know is in need of help, you can call Lifeline 24/7 on 13 11 14. So psychiatric disorders are conditions that affect our mood, thinking and behaviour, and they're really quite common and will impact about 1 in 8 people. This equates to impacting about 1 billion people worldwide. So some of the common psychiatric disorders that I study include major depression, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and anxiety. And so with these disorders, we largely don't know the cause, particularly on a molecular level. However, it is thought it's due to the interplay of changes in your brain, the environment that you live in, your genetics, as well as your development. And so when we consider psychiatric disorders, there's a lot of different overlap in symptoms. So if we kind of focus on a different example, so treating illnesses that present the same. Consider you have a runny nose. It's constantly bothering you, and it could be due to several causes. And how you actually treat that runny nose is going to be different based on the underlying cause. So if you have allergies, you might use antihistamines. If you just have a cold, it might be some cold and flu medicine, or you could have a sinus infection, in which case your doctor would prescribe you antibiotics. So if you had simple allergies and were given antibiotics, the antibiotics aren't actually going to treat that runny nose, and you'll still be left with that symptom. And so this is an issue that we have when it comes to psychiatric disorders. So there is a lot of overlap in the symptoms of the different disorders. So what I've got here on the screen is kind of bringing things down to a simple scale. On one side, we have major depression, which is a lot of symptoms of depressive, low mood, and feelings of fatigue and things like that. Whereas on the other end of the scale, we have schizophrenia, which will commonly include also symptoms of depression, but also things like psychosis and mania. We also then have bipolar disorder in the middle, which will exhibit symptoms of both of these disorders. And so if you go to your GP or your psychologist presenting with some of these symptoms, quite often you will be misdiagnosed and they won't be able to treat you appropriately because we don't actually know what's causing these symptoms. And so what I'm hoping to do is start to identify the causes of these disorders, particularly in the brain. In terms of treatment, it's not optimal for most of the psychiatric disorders. About a third of people will have an optimal response. So with the first treatment that they're prescribed, another third will have to try several treatments before they have a therapeutic effect. And the final third are what we consider to be treatment resistant. So they won't have an ideal response to any of the available medications. In addition, when treatment does work, it can take weeks to months to have any effect. And those that are on these medications report numerous side effects. And that's largely because we don't know what we're actually treating. An interesting fact about a lot of the treatments for psychiatric disorders is that they were discovered by serendipity. So a lot of them we discovered by chance when we were treating other things and discovered that these certain drugs had an antidepressant or an antipsychotic effect. And so despite this, they are quite effective in the individuals that they do work, and they've allowed us to make incredible progress in how we treat and understand these disorders. But imagine how much better it would be if we actually understood what was happening in the brain and knew what we could target for these specific treatments. We'd be able to have quicker treatment, it would be more personalized, and there'd also be less side effects because we would be directly targeting things that have changed in the brain rather than going in with this more global targeted treatment. So in order to understand what is happening in the brain, I use human brain tissue from individuals that have had these disorders during their life. So this brain tissue is post-mortem, so these people have passed away and they've donated their brains to brain banks around the world. So we obtain brain tissue from these brain banks across the US, the UK, and Europe, as well as here in Australia. And so we put in a request to say obtain brain tissue from 100 different individuals. And what we get sent is about a pea-sized part of a brain. And from this, we're able to explore hundreds of different molecular pathways and hopefully identify alterations in individuals that have experienced a psychiatric disorder. So if we can identify some of these alterations, we're better informed to understand the disorder. We can hopefully start to group individuals on similar pathologies in the brain, but ultimately it's hoped that we can then identify novel treatment targets. So the research I do focuses on several brain regions. So up on the screen, I have some different images of the brain. So this is from the outside, and this middle one is cut straight through the middle of the brain. So I'm examining 3 key brain regions, all that have different functions in the brain. The first one being our prefrontal cortex. This is the section at the front of your brain, and it's responsible for your personality and what makes you you. The second region is our anterior cingulate cortex. It's a C-shaped structure right in the middle of your brain, and this is responsible for producing your emotions. And then the last region is our hippocampus. It's towards the back of your brain, and it's a little seahorse-shaped structure, and this is where your memories are formed and stored. And so I'm really interested in exploring whether or not these regions are functioning as they should, and also whether or not they're communicating together as they should be as well. And so how does our brain communicate? What I've got up on the screen here is what we call a synapse. So there's billions of these around the brain, and it's all about sending messages between each other. So what we have up the top here is we get these messenger chemicals, which are called neurotransmitters. They're released, and they bind down here to send a message. We can kind of think of this like sending mail. I'm sending some mail here, the mail gets delivered to our letterbox, and then the message is received. I'm interested in finding out how much mail is being sent around the brain. If there's too much mail, what we have is that this letterbox here is going to get overwhelmed with messages, and we're going to get an abundance of information coming through. On the other hand, we might not have any mail being sent, in which case this letterbox sits empty and there's no information being received. And lastly, we can also have too many letterboxes, in which case we have a greater capacity to receive this information. And so while this can be a good thing, it can also overwhelm the brain, and it can start to shut down in some of these core functions. And so it is important to consider that the brain is really, really complicated. And the research I'm doing is focusing on a small puzzle piece of a bigger picture. So the brain itself is made up of billions of cells and thousands of signaling systems. And so it's important that we always consider to take a step back and think about how our research fits in the broader picture of the brain. So one of the key parts of my research is focusing on sex differences, which surprisingly haven't been considered a lot when it comes to molecular research. And this is quite surprising, as there's a lot of differences in how males and females will present with these disorders. So in terms of depression, females on average will have double the prevalence rates compared to males. They will have an earlier onset, a greater severity, and are more likely to experience recurrent episodes, so several episodes of depression during their life. In addition, in terms of anxiety, females are up to 4 times more likely to experience this compared to males. On the other hand, when we look at schizophrenia, there's an equal prevalence between males and females. However, there's an earlier onset in males, whereas females will have a greater incidence after menopause, where we believe that estrogen, so our sex hormones, may be somewhat protective against schizophrenia. In addition, females with schizophrenia will have greater affective symptoms, which are things like the symptoms that we see in depression. And lastly, there's also differences in their treatment response. So females require a lower amount of antipsychotic drugs to see the same effect in the clinic. And so just based on these prevalence data, as well as when people are experiencing these disorders, it's clear that there must be some sort of biological driver of some of the differences that we're seeing. However, we don't understand the cause of these differences, and for really focusing our attention on understanding this would ultimately improve our therapeutic options across both sexes. The other component of my research is considering how inflammation, which is our body's kind of natural response to stress or infection, overlaps with these psychiatric disorders. And so there's actually a lot of overlap in the symptoms that you'll see of mood disorders, which is your depression and bipolar disorders, as well as autoimmune disorders, and both have a higher prevalence in women. We've also seen that there's increased inflammation in the brain in depression and schizophrenia. And so we think that maybe these groups with higher inflammation may respond better to different treatments, because we may be able to first target that underlying inflammation before we go on to subsequent treatments. And so when we've investigated the brain in major depression, I spoke before about sending all these messages around the brain. When we've looked at the amount of messenger chemicals in the brain in our cohorts overall, so comparing individuals with depression to those without, we saw that there was the same amount of this messenger chemical, which can go out and send those messages and information around the brain. However, when we split this cohort into males and females, we actually saw that females had a significant reduction in the amount of this messenger chemical in depression, which indicates that for the particular pathway I was looking at, that females were only affected for depression, whereas males stayed the same. When we've considered the brain in schizophrenia, we've looked at the number of those letterboxes. So how many receptors were there in the brain? And we actually found completely opposite findings. So In females with schizophrenia, they had an increase in the number of receptors, whereas it was decreased in males. And so if we take this to a treatment perspective and wanted to target that receptor, we would have really big differences in how we would want to treat those changes. We wouldn't be able to use the same drug. So if we kind of simplify this a bit, in our females with schizophrenia, there's too much, and in males with schizophrenia, there's not enough of this receptor. If I was to use the same drug to treat everyone with schizophrenia, I'm actually going to make one of these groups worse. And so what we really need is this specific treatment for females where we're trying to reduce it, and males where we want to increase the number. And so ultimately, using these different treatments, we can restore that balance. And so it really highlights why we need to be considering these subgroup differences for our research. And so overall, when we're looking at translating this research, we need to recognize that women live longer, but actually suffer more from chronic illnesses, misdiagnoses, delays in their diagnoses, and also suffer more side effects of drugs. And so this isn't really surprising, as a lot of the research to date has been conducted in males. So a lot of the clinical trials have been conducted in males, as well as a lot of the models that we use to design these drugs have also been in preclinical male models. So it's really not surprising that we don't treat females adequately because we don't understand what's happening. And so it's not all doom and gloom. There are changes now starting to happen where we're seeing new mandates that require males and females to be included at all levels of research. So this means from our basic science all the way up to our clinical trials, we need to be including both sexes. And so the results I've presented from my research really support the need of this approach because we're potentially missing a lot of crucial information if we are just grouping everyone together. And so despite these mandates being introduced, a lot of studies now do include both males and females, but they're not examining these sex-specific differences in their data. And so for example, in the field of neuroscience and psychiatry, about 20% of studies are designed so that they could examine sex differences, but only 5% are. And so we're seeing this start to pick up more recently. And so there is a promising trend that this will improve over time. But if it doesn't, it's quite concerning because we will be losing out on so much valuable information if we aren't embracing the power of studying sex differences. And so in terms of my own research, where we're hoping to move all of this is looking at testing new treatments and really unraveling these sex differences. So my research starts with the human brain samples where we're identifying what's different. Are there sex differences and are there things that we can potentially target? From there, we can move into things like stem cell models, which allow us to study brain cells from individuals that have had these disorders. But the limitation of this model is it is isolated brain cells. And so we don't really understand how it interacts as a full organ. The next step from here is moving into rodent models, which allow us to examine how a brain works in response to different treatments that we may have designed. So it also allows us to examine how the brain and body work together. But importantly, we can then start to unravel how these different treatments are working across the different sexes. And if all goes to plan and we get through this pipeline, we ultimately hope that we will be able to then move these treatments into clinical trials, where we're hoping that these results will assist in personalised treatments for psychiatric disorders. And so ultimately, we're hoping that that will improve treatment outcomes for the millions of people that aren't receiving adequate treatment. And thank you for listening.
It's more fascinating the second time than the first time I heard this presentation. Thank you so much, Samara. Don't go. Right, so I'd now like to open the presentation up for discussion and questions from the audience. And for those online, if you can enter your questions in the chat function if you have any, and then Sarah will read them out to us. So do we have any questions from the audience for Samara?
I've got questions, but there was a lot more complicated than I thought. So the research now into women's health, obviously yours is very specific about the brain. It's only just emerging, isn't it? Like the diagnosis across the board is not clear because we haven't been doing it. So can you elaborate a bit on like where we are in terms of our level of starting to learn about women's health, apart from your own area generally?
So the question for those online is, can Samara please provide more or less a state-of-the-art update on how we are faring as far as investigations are concerned with women's health?
Yeah, so we're moving in the right direction, and I would say in different fields we're a lot further ahead. So things like cardiac health are going in leaps and strides in terms of women's health. There's a lot of interplay between the menstrual cycle and actually your risk of different cardiac diseases. There's a big push there. I would say neuroscience is probably one of the further back fields in terms of understanding women's mental health in particular. And for a long time it has, I would say that we're seeing a shift now, and there's actually like a lot of incredible female researchers also pioneering that field now and making sure that there is this attention being put on it. But we're also seeing that from governments around the world, that there is this push that it's really crucial that we are investigating it all. I think we'll start to see the outcomes of these mandate changes in the next few years, because research is quite slow, and so it will take several years before we see the output of this importance of considering sex differences. But it's definitely becoming a really important topic that people are taking note of now.
Is there an age group with young females for anxiety and depression? Is there an age group more so, or is it overall?
Yeah, so the question is relating to anxiety and depression in young girls and women, whether there's an age group where there's a higher prevalence.
Across the lifespan, I'm not 100% sure for anxiety, but for depression, and it's shifting all the time now, especially with social media, I guess, is another role that we now are considering in terms of that environment and development. So you kind of see these several different peaks for depression, at least. So you've got that early onset, but then you also have postmenopausal depression, postpartum depression, perinatal depression, things that I guess shift women's health or their hormones out of the regular, or what we consider regularity. Yeah, there's this huge interplay between hormones and depression for females, at least. But over the lifespan, these disorders have a higher prevalence in females for the whole time.
Yeah, I just noticed that just in the sports section, a lot of young females now are having a lot of anxiety and depression.
Yeah, I would.
I'm saying 10 to 13.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we're seeing that age shift earlier and earlier. But yeah, a lot of my research being more post-mortem, I don't look at the clinical side as much, which we're seeing that younger cohort. But yeah, it's kind of concerning that it is getting earlier in terms of the anxiety in particular.
I think also, yeah, a lot so in females, but also in males. So
yeah.
I've noticed in sport, it's actually increasing a lot more in younger age groups.
Yeah. No, it's concerning. It's very like important that we are. I think there's also a greater push now. For a while, particularly in depression, it was males just not coming forward. And we are seeing a kind of a steady rise, but nothing out of unexpected, I would say, in terms of males. I think, yeah, the data is quite strong there in terms of the number and prevalence across the sexes.
Sarah, are there any online?
Not yet.
Okay.
I did put a reminder.
That's great. Okay, well, thanks, Samara.
Thank you.
And it gives me pleasure to now introduce our next presenter for this evening, who is Associate Professor Ric Lovell. He's an expert in sport and exercise science at the University of Wollongong. Ric is preeminent in his field, and he's published his work widely in sports physiology and performance science, primarily in team sports. During his career, Ric has consulted for a number of elite teams and governing associations at professional, regional, state, confederation, and international level. This work has focused on translating research evidence into practice, educating key stakeholders, and contributing to policy development in the context of player welfare. So I really look forward to Ric's presentation, which is entitled Training Women in Football, Training Women as Women in Football. Sorry, Ric, please.
Right, thank you. Thank you, Bradley. Thank you, everyone, for giving up your Thursday evening. Privileged to be able to share some of the work, but really what I'm going to talk about is probably a little bit controversial, stimulate a little bit of thought. So the question I'm going to ask you that I'd like you all to come up with your own answer for by the end of this talk is, women's football, is it a different ball game versus men's football? Now, I'm not going to make a decision anyway, but I'm just going to share some evidence with you and let you make your own mind up. So we have the same rules. We all play on the same pitch dimensions. We use the same size goals. We use the same balls and the same size of balls, the same weight of ball. And at least at adult level, a game is 90 minutes in duration. But as Samara's alluded to, and I'm going to go a little bit further into, we have very, very different physiology and physical capacities that enable us to play this game. So this figure, it looks quite complicated. It was actually from a position statement that was sent to the IOC around sex differences. And what it does is it summarizes hundreds of years worth of research looking at differences in physical capacities and the underlying physiology of males and females. Now, of course, the numbers that you can see here are average. And I want you to remember that through the next 15, 20 minutes or so, because we will always see lots of variation, okay? But on average, we're not going to go through all of these here, but we see some significant differences like females have 45% less hemoglobin, which is less oxygen carrying capacity around the body. If you look at things just like limbs physically, we've got males are 9% taller. They have 14% wider shoulders, longer humerus, longer femur. And if you know anything about mechanics, those longer limbs certainly help out if you're trying to move at a quicker speed, or you're trying to have an aerial challenge for someone in football, or you're trying to save a ball in the top right-hand corner, or whatever it might be. And you can go across all the world records that are shown on here, and you've got differences in things like jumping, about 18% between male and female world records. If we go back to football, maximum kicking velocity is about 12% faster in male versus female athletes. So we've got very, very different physical capacities on average. Let's put this into the context of a goalkeeper, all right? So as I mentioned before, we've all got the same size goals. They're 2.4 meters high and they're 7.32 meters wide. So if we take the average height of a male versus female goalkeeper, okay, so this is data taken from the last couple of World Cups, where FIFA provide the heights of all the players. And we also look at the average jumping heights that those athletes can do when we measure them in our sports science laboratories, or we're physically profiling our athletes. You can see straight away here that there's a little bit of a difference in terms of the capacity of the average female goalkeeper to be able to cover the whole of the goal. Now, if we scale down based on these physical and physiological capacities, technically speaking, FIFA hate it when I present this slide, by the way, but technically speaking, we should be using different goal sizes. Of course, that's not really pragmatic, it's not sustainable. But another way of thinking about it is if we had a mythical third sex, and the differences in physiology and physical capacities between males and this mythical third sex was exactly the same. So this is what a goal would look like for a male player if they were playing the same game with the same physical differences. Let's look at the ball. Okay, so the ball, size 5 ball is 430 grams. If we scaled the ball down to meet the standard physiological differences, it should be a little bit smaller in women's football, around 370 grams, more like a size 4. And actually, this was trialed about 15 years ago, 20 years ago, but it never really took off. That is the equivalent, if we make the same leap, to men playing football with a basketball. And I don't know if anyone's tried to kick one of them in the back garden, but it generally hurts. Okay, so just something to think about. Now, if we apply this to the length of games and the pitch sizes that we play on, we've got the standard in the middle here for 90 minutes. If we were to scale it down based on physical and physiology, actually, we would say that women's football should be played on a fair smaller pitch, about 20%. But the equivalent of that is men playing on something that more represents an AFL oval as opposed to a football pitch in terms of sizes. And then in terms of the duration, the time of the game, 70 minutes, theoretically, is what we should have for women's football. And again, this is all hypothetical, but for the men, it should be more like 113 minutes, which it has been actually in the last World Cup. But actually, the last Women's World Cup this was the average duration as well now with VAR and all those sorts of things. So that's all hypothetical. What happens in the real game, right? We're looking at physical differences between men's and women's players. So let me ask you this. In the last, well, it's not the last 2 World Cups now, but if we compare Russia and France World Cups, all the physical data that's collected by the players as they run around the pitch, which sex covers more distance on average at those World Cups?
Female.
Hands up for female. It's a trick question. Hands up for male. It's the same. Okay, on average. So what you can see here are actually team totals. So the average of all the players across the game, because of course teams have substitutes. So we don't take the average, we take the total of all the team across the duration of the game, and you've got less than 250 meters difference there, okay? What you can see in the bar graphs here is how that distance is broken up. So of course, when we run around a football pitch, sometimes we walk, sometimes we stand still, sometimes we jog, sometimes we work really, really fast, we might be sprinting. And what you can see here, sorry, backwards. Or can I not go backwards? Maybe not.
You might need to use the back key.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. What we can see here is how it's broken down between these different speed zones. So there's very little difference until we get to sprinting and high-speed running. And you might not see this because we have to show all of these distances on the graph. But if I was to zoom in here, there's a bit of a difference in that the male players would do a bit more sprinting, whereas the female players tend to do a little bit more of that jogging, recovery runs in between transitions of play, okay? So there are some subtle differences there, but on average, we're covering exactly the same distances. Now, let's just do a little bit, not too much, a little bit of theory here, which might explain some of these trends. And the main one I want to talk about here is muscle fiber type, which you may have heard of before. So we have different types of muscle fiber in our muscles. You might have heard of them of slow twitch or fast twitch fibers. Sometimes you might hear them of small or large or red and white. either way, I've got you covered here. So we've got small twitch muscle fibers on your left as you look at the slide. So they're a little bit smaller. They've got lots and lots of delivery infrastructure for oxygen, which helps us create the energy that we need to move around the pitch. So we've got lots of blood supply. We have lots of mitochondria, which are a little bit like our engines in the cell that help us go. What that means is we've got these sorts of fibers have a long battery life. They can go on and on and on and on because they've got a good supply of oxygen and nutrients. White muscle fibers are a little bit different. They're bigger, they're faster, they're much more powerful, but they're also very fatigable. They don't have a long battery life. They generate a lot more power, but quite quickly we run out of that power. And one of the major sex differences between men's and women's football is the proportion of muscle fiber types. I'll figure it out in a minute. That being that genetically, males have more fast twitch muscle fibers than females. That allows them to be about 30 to 40% more explosive, which explains some of those physical differences that I mentioned before about sprinting, kicking the ball, all those kinds of things, power. But female players have a superpower themselves, and that is that they have much more of the slow twitch muscle fibers, which means that they've got far better endurance or fatigue reducing, if you like. They don't have as much fatigue as male players. So not quite as explosive, but got more stamina, okay? So how does that affect our training? Well, actually, it affects almost every programming parameter that a sports or exercise science might try to use when they're prescribing some kind of exercise program. So if you think about all the different factors that we might consider, it might be the intensity that you work at, how hard should you be working, the duration of whatever the activity is, if it's running, if it's in the gym, when you might have any recovery periods, what the intensity of that recovery or relief period might be, and the duration of that period, how many sets you might do, and how many series you might do to get any kind of adaptation, whether this is an endurance adaptation, whether it's a muscle strength or power adaptation. We need to train women as women and use their physiology and their superpowers appropriately. So even things like time between sets and series. So everything we've learned about what we train in the gym, what we might do if we're trying to build endurance, what we might do in terms of our small-sided games or whatever it might be for training, all of those programming parameters that we've been learning about all come from men's physiology over hundreds of years of research. So all the textbooks we're reading, any coach education you go to, any recommendations comes from men's football. It's a different game, isn't it? How this might play out after matches, for example, these differences in the physiology. So what we've got here is we've got a game of football on any given day, and then we've got time after the game. So 0, 24, 48, 72 hours, okay? What we have on the y-axis here is how much something is affected. Okay, now in this first slide, we're actually talking about performance. So if we all go out and play a game of football, for the next 24 to 48 hours, our physical performance is going to be a little bit limited than it was before, okay? We'll be fatigued, we might be a little bit sore. And if we try to track those trends between male and female players, this is what we see. We see that female players also have those reductions in performance, but not to the same extent as male players, because they're less explosive, they're using less of those fatigable muscle fibers, those big muscle fibers that are powerful, but they get damaged and they get fatigued quite quickly. So the effect is still there, but not the same. And the other thing about the effect is how long it lasts, okay? Female players tend to recover quicker than male players. And if we translate this into muscle damage, so this is what you might feel after a hard exercise bout, you might feel sore in the muscles that we've used, we see a very similar trend. But there's one caveat to this, and that is the menstrual cycle. And we know that at certain phases of the menstrual cycle, particularly the late luteal phase, so just before menstruation, we see changes in the recovery profile, and it actually slows down the recovery profile. So depending on what, if we've got a naturally menstruating female, their recovery might be slower at certain phases of that cycle. What implications could this have? Certainly could have implications for training scheduling. So in theory, at least, we know that females recover quicker. So potentially they can start training the next week much earlier. If we really want to unlock female athletic potential, we should be training them as women. And I mentioned the menstrual cycle before. This is another thing that we have to consider and makes it a little bit more complicated when we're training our female athletes. We know that in terms of menstrual cycle, about 95% of players can have some form of symptomology every cycle. 66% of those players think that it affects their performance, either in training or in matches. 1 in 3 say that they actually change their training, whether it be the duration they train, the intensity they go at, because of whatever symptoms that they might be experiencing. Because this is a cultural taboo, 90% of our players wouldn't dream of speaking to coaches about this, potentially because at the minute, 70% of coaches in women's sport are male. So we've got a barrier to break down there. About 41% have experienced really heavy bleeding. And probably the biggest concern for us is about 85% of female football players do not have sufficient knowledge about their own menstrual cycle because it's such a taboo subject. We don't teach it, we don't talk about it. And so everyone thinks their symptomology is normal. What does this mean for a typical squad of players? If you've got 24 players in your football squad, about 22 of them are feeling some kind of symptomology during every cycle, if we assume all of that squad is naturally menstruating. To be honest, it probably won't be. It's normally about 40% are on hormonal contraception or some form of contraception. About 16 of those squad will say that affects their performance. 8 of them would be heavy bleeders. 3 of them potentially have endometriosis, and 5 of them potentially have PCOS. If we start looking at things like injuries, we have very different injury profiles to the men's game. So what we have down here is the incidence rate, so how often an injury will happen. And on this axis, we've got the severity of the injury, so how long someone is out for. And if you look at some of the common injuries, we know that there's massive differences in the fact that at the minute, women's players have less hamstring strains. That's changing as the game professionalizes, but it's probably because they're a little bit less explosive, so they don't generate those really high forces that cause the hamstring muscles to strain. They get a little bit less hip and groin pain, but they get far more ACLs than male players, and that's a really severe injury. And they get far more severe calf muscle strains. So it takes female players longer to recover from calf muscle strains than it does for males, even though the incidence rate is the same. And with ankle ligament sprains, we have female players have more of them, and they also take longer to recover. So their incidence and severity are worse. So let me re-ask you the question again. Women's football, is it a different ball game if you consider physiology, sex differences, the differences in fatigue between male and female players and the work rate that they do in games, the scheduling, the training scheduling, the injury burden, and the female health challenges that we might experience in a typical squad. What makes this super difficult is the sex data gap, as I alluded to before. So this is a really quick summary of any publication that had football or soccer in it over the last 20 years. And as you can see, the blue bar there, there's or at least 3-4 times more research published in the last few years in men's football than there is in women's. Now that is changing, but at the current rate, it's going to take us another 108 years before we catch up. So we need to do something drastic to really increase our knowledge so that it translates into performance and we start to train train women's players as women. So 2 things that we're involved with at UOW to try and help accelerate that sex data gap. One is we're working with a really new initiative called the Kineska Innovation Hub. We're one of 8 universities around the world that are part of this hub. This is the brainchild of a lady called Michelle Kang in the US, who owns 3 football teams around the world, Washington Spirit, Olympic Lyon, and recently the London City Lionesses. And she's established this Kineska group, and she wants to revolutionize how we train female athletes and unlock their athletic potential. To do that, she launched at the Paris Olympics her app that's been developed to try and improve education to our female athletes and also give them tools to track their own health and how that to try and minimize the health impacts on performance. The app is free. It will sync to certain wearables so that you get all your information in the same place. And that's going to continue to grow and grow in terms of the wearables that it interacts with. So if you have, for example, an Oura ring, which tracks things like body temperature, your sleep, your heart rate, it will sync with this. And this app is all about tracking menstrual cycles at the minute, but we will evolve that to other reproductive statuses as well over time. She's also investing really heavily in research. So we're fortunate that next year we'll have 2 funded Kineska PhD scholarships to help us bridge this gap into training women as women. And the second thing that we're doing is working really closely with FIFA. At the last World Cup, they launched their female health project, which again is about raising awareness, providing resources to help all stakeholders within the women's game learn more about female health, how it impacts performance, and how we can start to train women as women. These resources are all freely available on the FIFA website. If you want to Google it, you can download the female health snapshot. And what we're working on with them right now is later this year, they will roll out a suite of free educational online materials for anyone in the game, players, coaches, athletic trainers, physios, to learn more about female physiology and how we can better train and provide medical support for our female players. So that's what we're doing. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that really insightful presentation. I'll lead off with a question, if I may. I was really interested by the recovery profiles that you showed, and then also the influence of the menstrual cycle on recovery. This is outside of your field, but take a stab at it. Do you think that this might translate into things like surgery as well and recovery from surgery?
You're right. This is out of my field. Well, the biggest problem we have with things like surgery and medical, and we looked at that on one of the slides there where I talked about the severity of the injury, and that for some of those injuries, it's taking a lot longer in female athletes. We think the main reason for that is differences in medical provision. Now that's changing, and it's changing at a really rapid rate with the professionalization and growth of women's football. But for a long time, there has been substandard medical provision, which means our players are getting not the best advice, not the best support. It's taking them longer to recover and potentially increasing the rate of re-injury. In terms of recovery from surgery, physiologically, that's a great question, I'm thinking. For some things, female athletes would certainly be, you would expect them to recover quicker in terms of their stamina, ready to play the game, but perhaps a little bit longer in terms of their strength development. And we know that strength is so important for reducing injury risk. So probably evens out, and we probably don't have enough data to conclusively answer that question.
Oh, that's all good. Yes. Question from the floor.
Yeah, Ric, you said with FIFA, have you done this to Football New South Wales and the FFA did, and their coach education system?
So the question is that Ric is involved with FIFA, and what about the New South Wales system?
Yeah, look, we have worked with Football New South Wales, probably on slightly different football-related projects, if I'm honest. I haven't worked so much with them on the female health side of things. I think they're reasonably proactive in this space. I think at the last couple of coaches conferences that they've ran, they've had one of UOW's PhD students who's a physio for the young Matildas, and she's been speaking to some of those coaches. But I think in terms of getting this information into coaching curriculum, I think there's work to do for every member of association and every confederation here in Australia, that we certainly need to work on our coach curriculum. But that's also responsibility of universities and educators and all stakeholders to try and evolve those coaching curriculums, I think. But
you've done the research.
Yeah.
Surely it would be vital for the FFA or Football New South Wales or Victorian Football to look at and say, right, under the coach education system, this is what we train, because I'm a coach educator and I'm a licensed coach. So when you look at this, and I've got a son that plays in America, so when you talk about their loads, I know his load is 6 games in 14 days.
Right.
And their women's program's the same.
Right.
So when you talk about load, and that's in America, and we have this lady in America, I don't know how they and do it. And then you're talking about injuries. Injuries come from, are you talking about grass or are you talking about on synthetic surfaces? Sure. Because synthetic surfaces, you're going to get more damage, aren't you?
Sure. So the question, I think, was around if the research has been done, why aren't we taking more action? And it's a really good question. When we say the research has been done, a lot of what I've talked about today is actually theoretical. So some research has been done, some of which I showed, but a lot of what I've talked about tonight is theory based off what you might read in a textbook or the research we know from general sex-based differences. And if we go back to that sex data gap, that the gap is huge. And so there are hardly any training studies. There are a few, but nowhere near enough training studies that are specifically designed for women so that we are absolutely confident that we should be training them, you know, for this many minutes or this intensity. We postulate that we should be doing it, but as you know, until we invest more in research and do more of these trials, we don't know conclusively exactly how to train them. And that's why there's this investment now from, you know, FIFA, organizations like Kainiska, there's others in the US like WUSI, to really speed up this translation so that we can actually put this into practice. So we have done research, but there's an awful lot more to do before we can make, you know, conclusive changes. So at the minute, it's more about, you know, getting people to think differently and think about how they coach female athletes before we can give them, you know, specific guidelines.
So is there any way of going to a club, a specific women's program club, and doing a research study there?
We are very open to collaboration for anyone that wants to come and do some research with us. Absolutely. Yep.
Okay.
All right, so we have another question. And then I'll come. Are you okay for your question?
I sort of had a similar question, but it was more, in place of putting that research into practice and you know, understanding how that works in reality. And interesting to note, obviously, some changes and differences in the rugby league game for the women with a shorter game time than the men. Their kicking distances are shorter. and those sorts of things, governing bodies for other sports, you're seeing them starting to take notice of this research and start to implement that in the changing dynamics of how the games are?
So the question,
Just
Yeah.
briefly, if you
Yeah.
can.
the question was around: are we seeing differences in other sports, and whether other sports are being a bit more perhaps proactive in differences and
I
education?
guess to create a better product, really.
So look, we're seeing a rapid evolution, a massive uptick in support available, resourcing available, education available. Certainly in the US and Europe, there's an awful lot happening across different sports, lots of initiatives. It's a really busy space right now. The problem is it's about 80 years too late. But we are playing catch up, and we will get there. I guess one point to finish on both of those questions around translation is one of the real challenges with women's sport and the research is that we have such huge variability given different hormonal profiles, reproductive status, such variability between players and even within players, from one menstrual cycle to the next. We need a lot of resource, time, and effort to be able to do those studies, because we probably need about 4 or 5 times the amount of study participants than we would do for the same study in men. So it costs a lot more, it takes us a lot longer.
Right, so very quick final question, Ric, please, and then I'd love to introduce Belinda. So
how come there's an increase in certain injuries such as ACL injuries in women in men?
Great question. So the question about differences in ACL injuries between men's and women's. We've generally got about an 8-fold increase in female ACLs than we do in men's in football or team sports. If I knew the answer to that question, I'd be quite a rich bloke, because everybody is trying to solve this problem. Some people think it's anatomy. So you've got and biomechanics, so wider hips in females, that affects some of the mechanics in and around the knee. Some people think there's hormone related factors. You mentioned surfaces before. Playing surfaces tends to be that globally females play more on synthetic surfaces, and we know that gives us a different injury profile. The one thing we can say conclusively is it's really difficult because there are so many different factors. It's almost impossible to predict, why that's happening. So there's lots of theories. People are saying that there's an ACL epidemic in women's sport. There actually isn't. There's just more exposure. So if you look at the incidence rate over the last 20 or 30 years, the rate hasn't changed. It's about somewhere in the region of 0.5 injuries per 1,000 hours of football activity. The rate hasn't changed. What's changed is professionalization in the game, growth of the women's game. We're playing so much more women's football, that exposure increases. And so the number of injuries increase. We're also starting to see the media attention that, again, is way overdue. So we're hearing lots more about those injuries. So the rate hasn't increased. We haven't got an epidemic. We've just got more football and more injuries, but a lot of work to do to try and reduce the incidence rate to closer to the men's. Great question.
Well, thanks, Ric. Thank you very much. Now I'm really delighted to introduce Belinda Barter, who's a former Matildas player. And Belinda started her soccer career in the boys team until the age of 12. And then in the women's seniors team at the age of 16. That's quite an amazing thing, as 16 playing in the seniors team, before making her way through the Sutherland Sharks into the New South Wales state team and onto the young Matildas side. She graduated into the Sydney Olympic Matildas squad, where she trained and played for 4 years in the goalkeeper position. She currently plays, and I hope this is still current, for the Russell Vale Pink side, and coaches aspiring soccer players, including in the South Coast Flame. So I'm really thrilled to have you here, Belinda. Please join me. I might see if I can stop sharing so that the screen Is that working? Can you see us online? Yeah, okay, excellent. All right, so I will invite questions from the floor for Belinda, but maybe first off, can you maybe walk us briefly through a bit of your journey as a soccer player and the experiences that you've gathered along the way?
Okay, so my journey as a soccer player was I grew up in the Shire, down in Sylvania Waters, and we lived near Gooley Bay Soccer Club, down on the soccer field down there. So I used to go to the soccer round after school on the weekends and play with the boys and have a kick. And then there was no such thing as girls soccer. So it's a big change from now, where every game you got full girls games. Back then we had nothing. So kicking a ball with boys down on the field, soon it was said, why don't you come and play with us? So down at that soccer club, a couple of gentlemen down there invited me in, and I got to play with boys for 10, 11, 12. And then the news was broken to me that you couldn't play with boys. Girls are separate, boys are separate. I guess getting back to the size, fitter, faster, stronger. And they said, well, little girls should stay there and boys can have their own comp. Now, unfortunately, back then, there was no girls soccer, no such thing. And girls couldn't play until senior women, where there's a senior women squad. However, you had to be 16 years old. So I used to go to the park every afternoon or whenever I could. And those same boys let me train with them for an additional maybe a couple of years, 2 or 3 years playing with them. And I used to watch them play on the weekend, but I could only train and not play. And then coming into senior space, I went into senior women and played in an all-females team, being 16 with older women, which was pretty daunting at the time. And then the man down at the soccer club said, listen, you're too good for these old women. There's a rep club up the road. So he took me to the rep club up the road, which was Sutherland Sharks up at Miranda. And I was selected to play rep football, soccer football with them. And then my journey began in women's sport. Soon after rep football, I was shifted straight into the New South Wales side as a field player, actually, not a goalkeeper. And I've always been quite a big girl, and two players broke their fingers in the New South Wales squad. And the Australian coach looked at me and he said, you're big, you can get in those goals. So I threw a goalkeeper jersey on, and I got picked in the Young Matildas. And then so that was in 1993. And I went through in the Young Matildas. In 1999, I was put in the Olympic athlete program for Sydney Olympics, but the news was broken to me that I was probably a little bit young. I had to wait for Athens and Beijing there. So I stepped aside. I was given a phone call in 2002 for a World Cup to potentially train. Don't know if I was going to be in the team, but to train and see if I could make it. But I declined the offer because I was at university and hadn't graduated. So the coach told me, I'm calling you. I said, I'll call you when I'm finished my degree. And he said, no. He goes, I'm calling you now. You come now, not when it suits you. Yeah. And that was unfortunately the end of my playing. However, I still kept involved in the game, playing locally. I've got a good friend here we went through the rep world with, playing, and made great friends. And I still coach now today.
Yeah, it's really fantastic passing on that experience to the next generation. I'm going to ask one more question, then I'll open it up to the floor. So, having had the lived experience that you have, can you maybe comment on the 2 presentations that we've just heard, and how they might have made a difference to you as an elite athlete in the day, and recalling that Samara's work on brain health and Ric's work then on the physical.
Yep. So we'll take it right back. I was like really impressed. I haven't been exposed to any lectures or anything like that. So back we'll talk about probably the national team. So what I was exposed to, what resources we had, which is probably very limited. I didn't know about any of this, so I've just learned a lot tonight. I guess we had a coach, manager, trainer. We did have a physio, and I think we could get a rub down or some strapping done, but I never really had the education. I remember I've gone to the Australian Institute of Sport about 6 times. So before every international camp, we would go in there. From what I recall, I never really did the mental health side. I remember getting the skin fold, so we'd have to jump in our underpants and stand there and run out, and I'd wait for everyone to be gone because I was one of the bigger girls, and they'd get the tongs out and squeezes. I don't know if that gets done now, but that's the only thing what I can remember and what I've lived through. So I didn't have all that. So on that side, I don't recall having any assistance, to be honest. On Ric's side, not really. So we'd do a beat test, a running test up and down the pitch, and they would record how fast we could go, maybe jumping, but that was all we had. Now, from what I believe is, or I know as a coach, when I'm coaching maybe shorter girls or kids, I'm thinking, well, you need to be this tall to go in goals, or we're not going to look at you. So the game's changed. So back then it was like, not really who was there, because there was a big group, and we did have to get selected for it, but we didn't have, I don't believe we had any of that. And I finished up in 1999, and the world's come a long way in the last 25 years.
It has. And thanks in part to people like Ric and Samara for the work that they're doing.
Yeah.
All right, so I'd like to open up to the floor now for any questions that you might have for Belinda. Yes.
What was it like to be a Matilda?
What was it like?
To be a Matilda.
To be a Matilda. Yeah.
Well, I was mainly, most of my career, or the Matilda career, was a young Matilda, it was still awesome. It was still awesome. I can still remember flying to Melbourne and playing, and having people on sideline waving to me, asking for autographs, asking for photos. I had one girl get a haircut the same as me. One of my friends' little cousin had beautiful long blonde hair, and she used to come every week to watch us play. And one week she turns up. She always used to turn up every week with a letter for me, and then a haircut like me. And so it's cool. Like, it's a really proud moment. Maybe if I could have taken it further into the senior Matildas. So I did a lot of mine in the youth space, and then back then we had very little support, and so I couldn't continue to what the girls have got now is outstanding. Yeah. It's very, very, very cool. So I follow it, I support it, I live it, I dream it, and it's a lot different to what I had. I don't even have a Matilda's jersey, so from when I played. So I would have to sit in a room and with the door closed, and they would count the jerseys, and then once all the jerseys were accounted for, the door opened and we're all out the door. So that was my Matilda experience, but it was very good fan base. They included us, and yeah, I love it. I still call myself a young Matilda.
That's fantastic. Any other questions? Yes, please.
What's your most severe injury?
Most severe injury.
I've got to say, at national level, not much, but at older level now. So when I was younger, I was quite lucky. I probably, my hands aren't the best. Probably hurt my fingers and stuff. But in my later years, I've done a medial ligament. I've torn a calf. That was when you talked about the calves. I've never experienced anything like it. Not anything like to drag my leg off the field. So yeah, and most recently I've broken the top of my finger. So everything's been in my later years.
Yeah, I can see you wearing the scar of your latest injury right there. Other questions from the floor, please.
What are your thoughts on girls playing with boys now?
Yeah, thoughts on girls playing with boys.
I think it could be good because you're challenged. So it just depends age relative. So back when we used to play in the New South Wales team, I remember playing in the seniors, and we would play against the under 16 boys. So that was sort of the age comparison which we would play. I hear a lot of recent now, you hear girls playing in the boys' game, and I guess it just keeps them working harder. I don't like sometimes how some of the boys come in and just, if you're not skillful, I don't like the idea of girls playing with boys. But if you're playing proper to the curriculum of Football Federation Australia, I don't think it's that bad, as long as you've got the right space you're playing in.
Sarah, are there any questions online? No?
Can I ask,
Please.
What was your reflection on the presentation, in particular, about this proposition of the size of the goals? You're a goalkeeper. Would you love a smaller goal, or would you like to see the blokes push for a bigger goal?
Should we change the goal?
I sat there thinking it made sense, and then I sat there thinking, well, I'm quite big. I feel like I feel the space. I was at a final on the weekend, so where I work down in Football South Coast, my Flame girls, and the Flame goalkeeper's about this big. And I was watching the goals thinking, oh my God, you're short. She's probably watching this. She's at Wollongong Uni. I'm like, oh my goodness, you're small in those goals. So it makes sense. It did make sense, what Ric was saying, but I like to all be equal. I like the idea of we're equal, we're on the same field, we're playing the same minutes, we're playing the same game. And I guess the goals were designed to be scored in, and we've just got to accept the size of the goal, and let's just keep it equal. But it was a good slide. I sat there. I really enjoyed both presentations. I haven't been exposed to anything like that.
Well, that's fantastic. So I'll ask you another question now while maybe people are thinking. So what advice do you give, and now maybe after tonight, would you give to the girls and young women that you coach? So what advice do you give them, and maybe how would you change that in relation to what you've heard this evening?
I'd say to reach out to what we've got, like this thing tonight, I guess if players knew about it, would have understood and come here, they could have understood more about their body, more about the game, and sort of what people are putting in to advance our game and bring it up to speed with maybe the rest of the world or the grades what are out there.
Indeed, and maybe the app that Ric was talking about, that educational piece, that'll be a game changer in that sense. Pardon the pun, but really just from an education, from the solace of and comfort of your room, you can learn about your body, how to adapt to it.
Yeah, I was really impressed. We need to know all this. It helps us. It will help us.
It does, and it will. Any other questions? Yes.
Continuing on from his question, would you prefer to see women play on smaller fields, or just have everyone play on the same size field, same time?
So following on from the question about the size of the goals, should the fields change, and what's Belinda's opinion on that?
I think at the highest level, keep it all equal. I like the idea of keepers equal, the females equal to the males. We can have separate comps. So we have summer soccer comps where the ground's shrunk, and now at my age when we play, we love it because it's all everything's shrunk. But that's at a casual level. But at international level or even local level, or your community sport, I just say keep it the same. It makes it easier. So we need field space. We haven't got space. So the space we've got, I think it's too hard just to be making modifications. Let's just all be equal. And have our separate comps for having smaller ones. So, when we get older or this or that. But they do have a smaller field, like for juniors. So juniors have a smaller field. Don't quote me, it depends if you're playing club football or rep football, but they can cut the field in half, and you play up to maybe under 12s or something on a half a field. And then they come to 18 yards, and you can play that size for another age group. And then you get into maybe 14s, and from 14s on, I know 14-year-old girls and boys are small, but they can learn.
Question on
I was just going to say, with the shortening, if it was to shorten the game time,
Yep.
And that would make it a bit more of an explosive, intense product. Would that increase the viewership of the game and the product, like, you know, make a better product?
So the question is whether shortening the time allocation for the game would make it more viewer friendly. And let me make an analogy here with the cricket. So where it's gone from the long day form to the 50 overs to the T20.
Yeah.
I think maybe it would certainly to make a game shorter. You might come out thinking, okay, I only need half an hour's worth of energy in the tank rather than 45 minutes. So it probably would, like the cricket, it's sort of a quicker, faster game if you do it that way. Once again, we keep it. If it's a smaller field, like you play summer soccer, you've got a smaller field, you've got a smaller time frame. If you're winning, you know, it's probably where you want. If you're losing, you need all the minutes you can get.
All right, the final question, and then we'll bring it to a close.
Vinny, what's the difference now? You're coaching, so what do you find the difference now, coaching the females than what it was back to your time?
Okay, so firstly, can I introduce Frank? He was my coach. So he was my coach for about 10 years when I played up at Sutherland. So thank you for coming, Frank, and for everything you did for me. Coaching now, you said males to females or just in general?
Shifts in coaching from previously to now.
Because you're coaching males and you're coaching females.
Yeah.
Years ago to what they are different now. What's like, you know?
I guess maybe coaches are more educated. I'm not sure how many licenses you had like years and years and years ago to be coaching. Now for us to become a coach, we've got to have the minimum of licenses. So we've I've got minimum. So your grassroots coaching, you've got your C license, your B license, your A license, your level one goalkeepers, diploma of goalkeeping. So we all go and do courses and we get taught the curriculum of Football Federation Australia, and then we bring that onto the pitch and we try and have a uniform approach. So all the kids, they start from the ground up and they're taught, I guess, by the book. We might modify certain things where we use our experience, or you just tailor it to your coaching method. But it's I think the courses do help us, so we're all coaching a uniform approach. In saying that, it's changed a bit. It has changed, like from when Frank was coaching me, but you've still got some basic fundamentals which are the same when we set and wait for the ball. Not wait or attack the ball now, but back then maybe wait. Now we're really pushing you to drive and attack that ball. So the game's progressed. The game's progressed a lot.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So that was fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and for entertaining all these questions. I'm going to bring it to a close there, and I'd really like to thank our presenters for this evening, and Linda, especially for you to coming in and telling us about a bit of your journey. And for people who've joined us online and for those in the room, thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I really enjoyed it a lot. So thank you very much. And for those in the room, at least, join us for some refreshments. Thank you.